Mark and Emily had always enjoyed the thrill of a good storm. They were avid hikers and often sought out the solitude of remote cabins to escape the city's hustle. This time, they decided to rent a small, isolated cabin deep within the Catskill Mountains for a long weekend. The forecast predicted severe thunderstorms, but they were undeterred. They packed extra blankets, flashlights, and plenty of firewood. The first night passed uneventfully, with only the distant rumble of thunder as they sat by the fireplace sharing stories. The second night, however, was different. The storm arrived earlier than expected, and by dusk, the wind howled through the trees like a wild beast. Lightning lit up the sky, and the sound of thunder shook the very ground beneath them. Despite the storm's ferocity, they felt safe inside their sturdy cabin, until the knocking began. It was faint at first, barely audible over the storm, but unmistakable. Someone or something was knocking on the cabin door. Mark and Emily exchanged uneasy glances. The cabin was miles from the nearest road. No one could have possibly found their way there in such weather. But the knocking continued, growing louder, more insistent. Mark grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the door, but as soon as he reached it, the knocking stopped. He threw the door open, expecting to see a lost hiker, or perhaps an animal seeking shelter. But there was nothing. No one. Only the storm raged outside, with the wind whipping rain into his face. He closed the door and bolted it securely, but the unease lingered. Emily tried to laugh it off, suggesting it was just a tree branch blown against the cabin by the wind. They returned to the fire, but the atmosphere had changed. What was once cozy now felt suffocating, oppressive. Hours passed, and just as they began to relax, the knocking resumed. This time, it was louder, more urgent. Mark's heart raced as he moved toward the door once more, but just like before, the knocking ceased as he approached. He flung the door open, and again there was nothing but the storm. This time, however, something caught his eye. A set of footprints in the mud leading from the woods to their doorstep. The prints were deep, as if whoever made them was heavy or carrying something. They didn't lead away from the cabin, they just ended at the door. Panic set in. Emily urged him to close the door, but Mark hesitated. His eyes scanned the darkness, searching for any sign of movement, any clue as to who or what could be out there. But there was only the relentless rain and the roar of the storm. Reluctantly, he shut the door and bolted it, grabbing a kitchen knife for protection. The knocking began again, this time from the windows from every side of the cabin. The sound was maddening, coming from all directions. Mark and Emily backed into the center of the room, clutching each other, their eyes wide with terror. The storm outside seemed to grow more violent with every knock, as if the storm itself was alive, angry. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the knocking stopped. Silence. The storm raged on, but the knocking ceased entirely. For a few agonizing moments they waited, holding their breath, wondering if it was truly over. A loud crash shattered the silence. The front door had been blown open despite being bolted. Mark rushed to it, slamming it shut, but not before a blast of freezing air hit him like a punch to the gut. He fought against the wind to secure the door once more, his mind racing with fear. When he turned back, he saw Emily standing rigid in the middle of the room, her eyes fixed on something just beyond his shoulder. He turned slowly, dreading what he might see, but there was nothing there. No one. The cabin felt wrong, as if it was no longer theirs. The air was thick with tension, the kind that presses against your chest and makes it hard to breathe. The fire, once warm and comforting, now cast grotesque shadows that danced on the walls like sinister figures. They didn't sleep that night, too afraid to close their eyes, fearing what might happen if they did. Morning came, and the storm subsided. The sun broke through the clouds, casting an eerie calm over the drenched landscape. They packed up quickly, not daring to stay another moment. As they left the cabin, they noticed something that made their blood run cold. The footprints, those deep, heavy prints, were still there, leading to the door. But now they saw a second set of footprints, smaller, leading away from the door and disappearing into the forest. They hadn't been there the night before. Mark and Emily never spoke of what happened that night again. They moved on with their lives, but the memory of that storm, of the knocking that came from nowhere, haunted them both. They never returned to the mountains, and to this day they wonder what would have happened if they had stayed one more night in that cursed cabin. Dry Creek was a small, forgotten town in Texas, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business, and secrets were hard to keep. But some secrets, the darkest ones, stayed buried. The town had its share of ghost stories, but none were as chilling as the one that unfolded during the Great Thunderstorm of 2004. Maggie was a local historian, obsessed with uncovering the town's past. She'd spent years sifting through old records and forgotten diaries, piecing together the history of Dry Creek. One story that fascinated her was the legend of the old Miller house, a crumbling mansion on the outskirts of town. The house had been abandoned for decades, ever since the tragic death of the entire Miller family during a thunderstorm in 1923. According to town law, the Millers had been a wealthy, respected family, but their lives ended in a mysterious tragedy. Some said they were struck by lightning, others whispered of a murder-suicide. The truth was never uncovered, and the house was left to rot, shunned by the townsfolk who believed it was cursed. On the night of the storm in 2004, Maggie decided to visit the Miller house. She was determined to document the mansion before it collapsed entirely. Armed with her camera and a tape recorder, she drove to the house as the first drops of rain began to fall. By the time she reached the mansion, the storm was in full swing, with lightning splitting the sky and thunder rumbling like the growl of some ancient beast. Maggie entered the house through a broken window, the front door having long since been swollen shut by years of neglect. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The floors creaked under her feet, and the walls were covered in peeling wallpaper and cobwebs. It was exactly what she expected, except for the feeling that she wasn't alone. As she explored the house, the storm outside grew more intense, the wind howling through the broken windows like a banshee. She set up her camera and began taking photos, documenting the dilapidated rooms and the eerie atmosphere. But as she moved from room to room, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. In the master bedroom, she found an old cracked mirror hanging on the wall. As she lifted her camera to take a picture, she saw something that made her blood run cold. In the reflection, she saw the outline of a man standing behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty. Shaking, she took a step back, and that's when she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper, like someone breathing directly into her ear. "Get out." Maggie's heart pounded in her chest. She knew she should leave, but her curiosity got the better of her. She pressed the record button on her tape recorder and asked, "Who's here? What happened to the Millers?" For a long moment there was only silence, broken by the roar of the storm. Then faintly she heard it again, a voice barely audible over the thunder. "They took everything." The room suddenly grew cold, unnaturally so, and the lights on her camera flickered. Panic set in. She grabbed her equipment and hurried back toward the window she had entered through. But as she reached the door, she heard a loud bang from behind her. She turned, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and saw the bedroom door slam shut on its own. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They echoed through the house, coming from every direction. "Get out! Get out!" The voice was no longer soft. It was angry, demanding. The temperature in the house continued to drop, and Maggie's breath came out in white puffs of air. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the window latch, but it was stuck, as if the house itself was refusing to let her leave. Suddenly, the window shattered, blown inward by a gust of wind. Maggie screamed as shards of glass flew at her, cutting her face and hands. She bolted for the front door, not caring that it had been stuck for years. She threw her weight against it, and to her surprise, it flew open with a deafening crash. Maggie stumbled out into the storm, her heart racing, her mind reeling. As she ran to her car, she glanced back at the house and saw something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. In one of the upstairs windows, illuminated by a flash of lightning, she saw the silhouette of a woman holding a child, both of them staring directly at her. She sped away from the mansion, not stopping until she reached the safety of her home. She tried to listen to the recording she had made, but all she heard was static, punctuated by faint, distorted voices. The photographs she had taken were even more disturbing. In each one, she could see shadowy figures lurking in the corners of the rooms, figures that hadn't been there when she took the pictures. Maggie never returned to the Miller house. She buried her research and tried to forget what she had experienced. but the memory of that night lingered. The mansion eventually collapsed, reclaimed by nature, but the legend of the Millers lived on, whispered among the townsfolk as a warning. Never go to the old Miller house, especially during a storm, because some secrets are meant to stay buried. Route 375, known as the Extraterrestrial Highway, is famous for its proximity to Area 51 and its many UFO sightings. But there's another lesser-known legend among the locals, a story of a deadly stretch of road that appears during the most violent thunderstorms, a road that many say is cursed. In the summer of 2016, Jack, a long-haul trucker, was driving through Nevada on his way to California. The night was clear, the stars bright against the vast desert sky, and the road was empty. He was making good time listening to an old country station on the radio when the weather suddenly changed. Clouds rolled in fast, blotting out the stars, and the air grew heavy with the promise of rain. Jack had driven through plenty of storms, but something about this one felt different, almost unnatural. The first crack of thunder rattled the cab of his truck, and lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the desert in an eerie, flickering light. The rain began to fall in heavy sheets, quickly soaking the road and reducing visibility to almost nothing. He slowed down, squinting through the windshield, but the rain was relentless. The radio cut out, replaced by static, and the GPS on his dashboard went blank. Jack cursed under his breath and turned on his high beams, hoping to cut through the downpour. That's when he saw it, a narrow, unmarked road leading off the highway. It wasn't there before, he was sure of it, but now in the midst of the storm it appeared, winding off into the darkness like a snake. Jack knew the route well, and there wasn't supposed to be any turnoff for miles. But something compelled him to take it. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was something else, but he found himself turning onto the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tight. The road was rough, barely more than a dirt path, and his truck jolted and bounced as he drove. The storm seemed to intensify as he ventured deeper, the lightning striking closer, the thunder booming louder. The desert landscape around him began to change. The cacti and scrub brush gave way to strange, twisted trees, their branches clawing at the sky. Jack's unease grew with each passing mile. The road didn't appear on any map, and there were no signs of civilization, no lights, no houses, nothing but the storm and the dark road ahead. The farther he went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as if the very air was charged with something malevolent. He considered turning back, but when he glanced in the rearview mirror, the road behind him was gone, swallowed by the storm. Panic set in. He pressed down on the accelerator, trying to outrun whatever force had drawn him onto this cursed road. That's when he saw the figure in the middle of the road. It was a man standing perfectly still, illuminated by the truck's headlights. Jack slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the wet road, but it was too late. The truck plowed into the figure, and Jack felt the sickening thud of impact. He stopped the truck and jumped out, his heart pounding in his chest. The rain was blinding, and the storm raged around him as he searched for the man he had hit. But there was nothing, no body, no blood, not even a footprint in the mud. It was as if the man had never been there at all. Jack was about to get back in the truck when he heard a sound that froze him in place, a low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of footsteps behind him. He spun around, his flashlight cutting through the rain, but there was nothing there. The growl came again, closer this time, and Jack realized it wasn't human. Fear overtook him. He ran back to the truck, slamming the door shut and locking it. He fumbled with the keys, trying to start the engine, but the truck wouldn't turn over. The growling grew louder, more insistent, and then he saw them, shapes moving in the darkness, circling the truck. They were tall, too tall to be human, their bodies twisted and wrong with glowing eyes that pierced through the storm. Jack's breath caught in his throat as one of the creatures stepped into the light, revealing a face that was a grotesque parody of a man's, with elongated features and a mouth full of sharp, gleaming teeth. The truck's engine finally roared to life, and Jack floored the accelerator, the tires spinning on the wet road before catching traction. He drove like a madman, the creatures chasing him, their howls echoing through the storm. The road twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the desert, away from any hope of rescue. Just when he thought he couldn't go any farther, the road ended abruptly, dropping off into a steep ravine. Jack slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt just inches from the edge. The creatures were gone, but the storm still raged around him, as if mocking his escape. Shaking, Jack managed to turn the truck around and retrace his path. The road, once so clear, was now barely visible, as if it was fading from existence. He drove back the way he came, his eyes darting to every shadow, every movement, fearing the creatures would return. Finally, after what felt like hours, he saw the highway up ahead. He turned onto it, the storm beginning to ease as he left the cursed road behind. He didn't stop driving until he reached the next town, where he parked the truck and sat there, trying to make sense of what had happened. No one believed his story when he told them. After all, Route 375 was full of strange tales, most of them nothing more than urban legends. But Jack knew what he had seen, what had chased him that night. He never drove that stretch of road again, and he warned every trucker he met to avoid it during a storm. But the road is still out there, waiting for the next unlucky traveler to find it, waiting for the storm to bring it back to life. And those who have seen it say that once you take that road, you never truly leave it behind. I've been a trucker for nearly 15 years, and something unforgettable happened to me back in 2017. I was driving an overnight haul through the Mojave Desert in California, heading toward Arizona. I believe I was delivering appliances, but I can't recall exactly. The darkness around me was absolute, with only my dim truck headlights to pierce through it. They had been in desperate need of fixing for a while, but I kept putting it off. Normally it wasn't a huge deal, but with hardly any other cars on the road, the poor lighting was painfully obvious. I had to strain my eyes every few minutes just to see the road ahead. I debated pulling over and waiting for sunrise, but I was short on time and money, so I pressed on despite the risks. I figured it was a straight shot, and I'd be fine. About an hour before sunrise, I noticed something coming at me fast from a distance. Fearing it might be an animal, I slammed on the brakes, bringing my truck to a screeching halt. To my surprise, it wasn't an animal but a car, parked dead center on the road, right on the double yellow lines. The passenger door was wide open. I stopped just a foot short of hitting it. I'm not the kind of guy who scares easily. I've been in more than a few bar fights, so I wasn't frightened by the car. I was more curious than anything. I thought maybe someone needed a jump start or some help, so I reversed my semi and pulled over. I considered setting out flares but decided against it, since I hadn't seen any other cars on the road. I got out of my truck and walked over to the car. It was a warm, still night, eerily quiet except for the faint ticking of the car's hazard lights. As I got closer, I saw that it was a new-looking red Ford Fusion. The passenger door was still wide open. I cautiously walked around the car and stopped dead in my tracks. It was completely empty. I checked the back seat and even the floorboards, but there was no one there. Suddenly, the situation didn't feel so harmless. I had expected to find someone needing help, maybe someone who had fallen asleep in a stupid spot, but the car was deserted. I started to feel uneasy. The darkness around me seemed to close in, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting someone to jump out at me. But the only light was what my truck's headlights provided. It was unsettling, to say the least. Despite my growing apprehension, I decided to investigate further. I looked inside the car, but everything seemed normal. The key was even in the ignition, though the engine was off. I got out of the car and headed for the trunk. Maybe I'd find some clue there. The trunk wouldn't open, so I went back, took the key from the ignition, and unlocked it. Still, the trunk wouldn't budge. It was jammed from the inside. I opened the back door, and to my surprise managed to access the trunk from there. Inside were 3 large, squished garbage bags and a rope tying the trunk closed. As I reached for one of the bags, The loudest gunshot I've ever heard rang out, shattering the silence of the night. I jerked up in shock, slamming my head on the car's roof. Panic set in, and without thinking, I threw the keys on the front seat and bolted out of the car. As I scrambled back into my semi, I heard a gruff voice shouting in the distance. He yelled, "Hey!" several times, his voice getting closer. I managed to get into my semi and started up, but my nerves were shot. I cursed under my breath as the engine stalled for a moment. Just as I got the truck moving, I saw him, a short, husky guy with red hair, wearing overalls and knee-high boots. He was standing by the trunk, holding a small shovel in one hand and an old hunting rifle in the other. For a few seconds, we locked eyes. He didn't look crazy, just worried. As my truck pulled away, he dropped his shovel and started waving his hands, shouting, "Wait," repeatedly. But there was no way I was stopping. As I drove off, I saw him in my rearview mirror, running after my truck for a few seconds before sprinting back to his car. I floored it, pushing my semi faster than I should have. After a few minutes, I thought I was in the clear, but then I noticed headlights approaching fast from behind. I've never been more scared in my life. I called the police and explained the situation as best as I could. By the time the car was right on my tail, it started honking like crazy. I didn't know what to do, so I just kept driving, praying he wouldn't try to ram me. After about 15 minutes of this, the car cut in front of me and slammed on the brakes, forcing me to slow down. Just as I was about to crash into him, I saw flashing police lights up ahead. The Ford swerved off the road and sped into the desert, disappearing from sight. I pulled over and waited for the officer to arrive. I frantically told him what had happened, but instead of chasing after the guy, he decided to take a report from me. I was furious. I told him twice that he could probably catch up to the guy if he left now, but he assured me they'd do a thorough search once backup arrived. He sent me on my way and said they'd call if there were any updates. They never did. None of my buddies have a story this crazy, and I've told it more times than I can count. You're probably thinking that guy was burying bodies, but the bags were too small for that, and the shovel was tiny. Some of my friends think he might have been dismembering something. For my own sanity, I like to believe he was burying an animal, maybe putting down a sick dog or dealing with some dangerous snakes. I really don't know. But ever since that night, I've never felt entirely comfortable driving through deserts after dark. I'm sure you've seen some of the more modern videos online where truckers document their daily routines and share tips with each other. Or maybe you haven't. As a younger guy in this industry, whenever I open TikTok or YouTube Shorts, that's all I see. I won't go into details, but I had to drop out of a pretty prestigious university due to personal reasons, and people often tell me I could have been more than a trucker. Honestly, it's not a bad gig though. I've been making deliveries for a little over 2 years now. The only really tough part of the job is the long hours. You can't truly understand how the isolation will affect you until you've experienced it firsthand. My only advice? Make peace with whatever demons might be lurking in your subconscious, because they'll definitely start eating away at your mind during those lonely hours. That's what happened to me. Anyway, this happened 3 months after I started working for my first company. I was as new to the trade as you could get. I was driving from southern New Jersey to Lafayette, Indiana, a 12-hour drive. That might not sound crazy, but consider that I had just completed an 8-hour trip beforehand, and it puts things in perspective. I wanted to get my deliveries done as quickly as possible, so I opted to drive through the night. My plan was to reach Lafayette just before 3 a.m. Everything was going smoothly, with virtually no other cars on the road, so I was able to push my semi a little faster than usual. About halfway through the drive, I reached down to grab a Red Bull from the center console only to realize I was out. Of course, I had forgotten to restock my truck after my last delivery. I slapped the dashboard a few times in frustration, knowing I'd have to stop somewhere. There's nothing I hate more than having to make stops during a drive. Maybe I'm unique in this, but I always get exponentially more tired when my vehicle isn't moving, even if I'm only stopped for a few seconds. After glancing at the navigation, I realized I had no choice. Either fall asleep on the road or stop and get an energy drink. In my mind, those options were pretty much the same. Reluctantly, I pulled into the first service stop I saw. I had no clue where I was, probably somewhere in Ohio at this point. Too late, I realized it wasn't actually a service stop, but an old abandoned gas station with what looked like a repurposed convenience store. Not sure if there's a better way to describe it. Either way, it looked like there was another quick stop store not far up the road, so I figured I'd check that out if needed. I parked the semi and made my way over to the first convenience store. To be honest, I was expecting one of two things. Either the place would be open or the door would be locked. You can imagine my surprise when the door swung open into a pitch-black store. I looked around, hoping I'd get lucky and find a drink or snack left behind. Just as I was about to turn around, my eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I noticed a faint glow coming from the corner of the room. I made my way over to it, and the glow turned out to be coming from a back room. Curiosity got the better of me, and I slowly opened the door. To my pleasant surprise, there was a plugged-in refrigerator against the wall. Eagerly, I opened the door, but there was nothing inside, literally nothing. The shelves had been removed and the whole appliance had been gutted. As I was closing the door, I was 90% sure I heard a noise from the main room, like something hitting the floor. I froze for a good 10 seconds. Had I imagined it? There was no way. Quietly, I walked back into the main room and looked around. Nothing. Part of me wanted to keep investigating, but I didn't have time for this. I walked out the entrance door and practically jogged to the other shop. Thankfully, it was open. I paid for my drink and hurried back to my truck. Something about this whole stop felt wrong, and I needed to get back on the road as soon as possible. I took one last glance at the abandoned store and noticed the door was now open. I was 100% sure I had shut it behind me. But it wasn't my job to figure out what was going on, so I started the engine and merged my semi back onto the highway. The caffeine started kicking in, snapping me out of my tired haze pretty quickly. My mind began to wander, and I started thinking about how bizarre the whole situation had been. I guess squatters in an abandoned building weren't the strangest thing in the world, but I couldn't explain that refrigerator no matter what theory I came up with. I tried to forget about it and kept driving. That's when I noticed something strange. Movement in the curtain behind me. Sweat started dripping down my forehead as I watched the curtain billow and move even though the air wasn't on. My worst fear was that someone was in my truck. I didn't have any weapons on me, so I discreetly punched in the nearest police station on my phone. The drive there was the most tense and horrifying 20 minutes of my life. I kept imagining someone reaching out to grab me or trying to crash my truck. Finally, I approached the police station. I stopped the semi as close as I could get and basically ran over to the building. Within seconds, my truck was surrounded by police. When they opened the back, what they found will stay with me for life. The police pulled out 3 homeless-looking people, 2 men and 1 woman. They were wearing rags and wrapped in filthy blankets. One of the men was armed with 2 switchblades. All 3 of them refused to talk, but stared at me menacingly as they were getting cuffed. I have no idea what they wanted, and I don't think I'll ever know. My name is Kevin, and I've been a trucker for various companies for the better part of 15 years. At this point, the job has become pretty routine. Pick up the goods, verify them, and deliver them as instructed. Since we're not paid by the hour, efficiency is key in this line of work. I've been doing this for so long that I like to think I can outwork the younger guys who are just getting into the industry. But this isn't always a good thing, especially since I often push myself to the limit, running on barely any sleep. 4 years ago, I was working for a warehouse based in North Dakota. For those who don't know, North Dakota is one of the flattest states, which makes trucking a bit easier. But it also meant that skipping a few hours of sleep could be the difference between keeping my job and getting fired. It was a chilly Tuesday morning in May. The beginning of the week meant more loads needed to be shipped, which meant more work for me. I wanted to knock it all out in one shot, so I mapped out my route into Montana, planning not to stop even once to sleep. I hit the road a few hours after lunch, expecting to reach my destination early the next morning. I pushed the semi as much as possible, maybe even a little over the speed limit. It was getting late, and I remember rubbing the crust from my eyes as the clock ticked past midnight. I was struggling to keep my eyes open, but I only had about an hour left, so I gritted my teeth and kept going. My buddy Tristan, who's also a trucker, introduced me to smelling salts when I first started. If you don't know, smelling salts are basically crystals in a little bottle. One sniff, and you're wide awake. You have to be careful though, because overusing them can be dangerous, or at least that's what Tristan told me. They burn your nose a bit, but whenever I needed a boost, I'd reach for the smelling salts first. This was one of those times. I took a big whiff, and it felt like a jolt of adrenaline shot through my body. I hoped the feeling would last the rest of the drive. About half an hour later, I was really struggling again. I started to doze off, and the blare of my truck drifting into the shoulder jolted me awake. This was getting dangerous. I needed to pull over, but there was nowhere to stop, just woods on either side of the highway. I slowed the truck down, desperately searching for somewhere to pull off. At this lower speed, my headlights cut through the darkness, and I noticed something that confused me, a purple dress lying in the middle of the road. What the hell, I thought, rubbing my eyes. Was I hallucinating? I blinked several times to make sure I wasn't going crazy. It was real. As I rolled by the dress, I couldn't help but stare at it. In hindsight, this should have been a red flag, but I was too exhausted to process what was going on. About 200 yards further, I passed a pair of shoes. Now I was starting to freak out. What the hell was going on? I passed the shoes, praying to God there would be a place to pull over soon. My old man David was a super religious guy, so I clutched his old cross, hoping he would come through for me. A little further up the road, I saw more random clothing, some of which looked like kids' clothes. This time, I stopped the truck. Panic started to set in. Something was very, very wrong. I sat in the driver's seat with the truck at a standstill, expecting something to happen, but nothing did. So I did what my instincts told me to do. I stepped out of the truck to inspect the clothing. I still remember the feeling of the chilly morning air piercing my skin, which definitely helped with my exhaustion. I approached the pile as cautiously as I could. It was indeed kids' clothing, both boys' and girls' clothes. I looked around into the woods, but I couldn't see much of anything in the darkness. I had my head on a swivel, worried this was some kind of trap. Deciding it wasn't my business to figure out what was going on, I made my way back to my truck. Just then I heard a crunch from the left. I whipped around, trying to see what was there. I stood still, waiting to hear another sound. After about 30 seconds, I heard another crunch, but this time from the opposite side of the road. My survival instincts kicked in, and I sprinted towards the truck. I jumped into the front seat, but just before I slammed the door, I heard a child's scream ring out. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I was caught at a crossroads. I wasn't about to fight some random people in pitch-black woods, but I also couldn't just abandon some helpless kids. Before I could make a decision, another almost identical child's scream rang out. Without thinking, I turned the truck on and pointed its nose towards the spot in the woods where I heard the noise. My headlights lit up about 30 yards into the woods, revealing 3 or 4 people, one of whom was holding a massive speaker. They ducked behind a couple of trees as my truck lit them up, but I had exposed them for just enough time to see what they were doing. They hid from the light before I could really make out any distinctive features, but I swear on my old man David's grave, they were trying to lure me into the woods with a fake kid screaming. I was in shock. I just sat there staring at the trees where those people had hidden. I reached for my phone to call the police, but before I finished dialing, I heard a thump on the body of the truck. Someone had thrown something from the other direction. I was done. I turned back to face the road and slammed on the gas. As I sped off, I could make out a person on the other side of the road. He shouted something I couldn't understand before launching something at the truck that cracked the glass of my passenger side window. I drove the final hour in silence, too scared to process what had just happened. There was no way in hell I was stopping to sleep in those woods. I completed my delivery and then passed out, sleeping for about 10 hours straight. When I woke up, the first thing I did was call the police, who told me they'd investigate those woods and give me any updates. I then thought about the whole situation and how stupid I was to get out of my truck. I should have just minded my own business, but the thought of kids being kidnapped or worse was too much for me to ignore. To this day, I still have no idea what those people were trying to do. I don't know why they didn't just rush me when they had the chance, or what they were planning to do if I ran into the woods after hearing those screams. In all my years of trucking, nothing has ever come close to being as strange or downright terrifying as this experience.
It was the fall semester at a well-known university in the northeastern United States. Sarah, a sophomore, had just moved into her new dorm room, a small but cozy space in one of the older buildings on campus. The room had a reputation. Students said it was haunted. But Sarah, being a skeptic, laughed off the rumors and went about her daily life. One night, after a long day of classes and socializing, Sarah returned to her dorm room. As she unlocked the door and stepped inside, she immediately noticed something strange. The air felt heavy, and a faint scent of something rotting lingered in the room. She searched for the source of the smell, but found nothing out of the ordinary. Shrugging it off as old building problems, she opened a window, let some fresh air in, and went to bed. The next few days were uneventful until one night, around 3 a.m., Sarah woke up to the sound of whispering. The voices were soft, barely audible, but unmistakably there. She sat up in bed, straining to hear where the whispers were coming from. They seemed to be coming from the walls. Heart pounding, she turned on her lamp and checked the room. Nothing. The whispers stopped as soon as the light came on. Nervous but determined not to give in to fear, she went back to sleep. As the weeks went by, the incidents became more frequent. Objects in her room would move on their own, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Sarah's sleep was disturbed night after night, and she began to feel like she was being watched. One day, while studying in the library, she overheard two students talking about her dorm room. They mentioned a tragedy that had occurred years ago. A student had committed suicide in that very room, hanging herself from the ceiling fan. Shaken, Sarah decided to research the story. She spent hours digging through old newspaper archives and university records. To her horror, she found the article. The student, a girl named Emily, had been alone or depressed and had written about hearing voices before taking her life. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Was she experiencing the same thing? Unable to bear the terror any longer, Sarah requested a room change. The university agreed, but there was a wait list, and she had to stay in the room for another week. That final week was hellish. The whispers were no longer just sounds, they were words. "Join me," the voice would say, over and over again. The smell of decay grew stronger, and Sarah could feel a presence in the room, cold and malevolent. On her last night in the room, Sarah woke up to find the ceiling fan spinning wildly, even though it was turned off. The voice was louder than ever, chanting, "Join me, join me, join me." Terrified, she grabbed her things and fled the room, spending the night in a friend's dorm. The next morning, she moved out for good. After Sarah left, the university sealed the room, marking it as uninhabitable. Rumors spread that Emily's spirit had finally claimed another victim. A student who had moved into the room after Sarah left was found dead, an apparent suicide. The cause? Hanging from the ceiling fan. In a small liberal arts college nestled in the quiet town of Millfield, strange occurrences were not uncommon. But the story of Jenna and her vanishing roommate, Alice, would become one of the most chilling tales ever told on campus. It began in the fall of Jenna's junior year, when she was assigned a new roommate after her previous one transferred unexpectedly. Alice was everything Jenna could have hoped for in a roommate: kind, quiet, and respectful of personal space. They quickly became friends, spending their evenings studying together or watching movies. Alice had a peculiar habit, though. She never talked about her past, where she was from, or why she chose Millfield. Jenna didn't push. Everyone had their reasons for keeping certain things private. One morning, Jenna woke up to find Alice's bed neatly made and her side of the room impeccably tidy as always. But Alice was nowhere to be found. Jenna assumed she had gone to an early class or maybe to the library. But as the day went on, there was still no sign of her. Her phone was left behind, and none of her other belongings were missing. Jenna began to worry. She reported Alice's disappearance to the campus police, who assured her they would investigate. Days turned into weeks, and there was still no sign of Alice. The police questioned everyone, but it was as if she had vanished into thin air. Jenna's worry turned into fear when she started hearing strange noises at night, soft footsteps, the sound of someone breathing just inches away from her, and once a quiet sobbing. Desperate for answers, Jenna began searching through Alice's belongings. In the back of the closet, she found a small, locked box. After several attempts, she managed to open it. Inside were old photographs, letters, and a small notebook. The photos were of Alice, but not the Alice Jenna knew. This Alice looked different, happier, carefree. The letters were from family and friends, all dated 2 years ago. The notebook was filled with Alice's handwriting, detailing a traumatic event from her past. She had been involved in a car accident that killed her family. Afterward, she had changed her name and moved to a different town to start over. But the last entry in the notebook was the most disturbing. It was written the night before she vanished. "They found me, I can feel them watching. I'm not safe. I need to leave before they come for me." Jenna's nights became unbearable. She could no longer sleep, plagued by the sensation of someone standing over her bed. One night, she awoke to see a shadowy figure in the corner of the room, staring at her with hollow eyes. She screamed, but the figure disappeared before she could react. The next day, Jenna moved out of the dorm. Alice was never found. Some believe she ran away, while others think something far more sinister happened to her. Jenna left Millfield before the end of the semester, unable to cope with the fear and the unanswered questions. But to this day, students in that dorm report strange occurrences, footsteps in the hall when no one is there, the sound of sobbing at night, and a feeling that they're being watched by someone they can't see. At the heart of a prestigious university stood an old library, a place where students flocked to study and research. But beneath its scholarly exterior lay a dark secret. For decades, rumors swirled about the library being cursed. Students who spent too much time there would either drop out, go insane, or worse, disappear. No one took the rumors seriously until a group of friends decided to investigate. It was the middle of the semester, and finals were looming. Sarah, Tom, and Emily, 3 close friends, had heard the stories about the cursed library and decided to spend the night there, partly as a joke and partly out of curiosity. They were determined to debunk the myth once and for all. They chose a secluded study room on the top floor, known for its eerie atmosphere. The walls were lined with dusty books, and the air was thick with the scent of old paper. As the night wore on, the friends laughed at how silly the rumors were. Nothing out of the ordinary happened, and they settled into their studies. Around midnight, Emily noticed something strange, a book lying on the table that none of them had brought. It was an old leather-bound tome with no title. Curious, she opened it and found it filled with strange symbols and indecipherable text. She showed it to Sarah and Tom, who brushed it off as some old artifact left behind by a previous student. But Emily felt uneasy. The symbols seemed to move, almost like they were alive. As the hours passed, the atmosphere in the room grew tense. The friends began hearing faint whispers, too soft to make out, but persistent. Tom suggested they leave, but Sarah, determined to prove the curse was a myth, insisted they stay. That's when the lights began to flicker. The room plunged into darkness for a few seconds before the lights came back on. But when they did, the study room was different. The walls seemed to close in, the air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder. Emily looked at the book again and screamed. It was no longer filled with symbols, but with names, hundreds of them, written in blood. At the very bottom of the list, she saw her own name. Panic set in. The friends grabbed their things and bolted for the exit. But the library seemed to have other plans. The hallways twisted and turned, leading them in circles. Doors that should have led outside opened to more corridors. The whispers turned into screams, and the air grew so cold they could see their breath. Finally, after what felt like hours, they found the main entrance and burst out into the night. They didn't stop running until they were far from the library. Gasping for breath, they vowed never to return. The friends tried to forget the incident, but something had changed. Emily became withdrawn, obsessed with the book. She claimed it was following her, appearing in her dorm room, her classes, and even in her dreams. Tom started experiencing terrifying nightmares, waking up every night at exactly 3:33 a.m., the time they had fled the library. Sarah, who had been the most skeptical, began hearing the whispers again, even outside the library. She found herself drawn back to the building, unable to resist the pull. One night, she returned to the library alone. She was never seen again. Tom dropped out of college, unable to cope with the terror that had taken over his life. Emily was found dead in her dorm room, the leather-bound book clutched in her hands, her name crossed out in blood. The university tried to cover up the incidents, but the story spread like wildfire. The library was eventually closed off, declared unsafe due to structural issues, but everyone knew the truth: it was cursed, and anyone who dared enter would never leave the same.
On a quiet night under the pale moonlight, life seemed ordinary between Hind and me, the woman who had suddenly entered my life, carrying with her a hidden secret. Little did I know that the strange warning from her mother, which I had initially dismissed, would turn into a curse that would haunt me in every dark corner of my home. 3 years of marriage passed without any notable issues until that fateful night when everything turned upside down. What began as a simple conversation quickly escalated into a heated argument, and I had no idea it would lead me to face a terror beyond imagination. What awaited me in the shadows was darker than I had ever imagined and more deadly than any nightmare I had ever dreamed. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to be the first to watch more thrilling and scary stories. Your support encourages us to bring you more. On the day I married Hind, her mother insisted on giving me a strange piece of advice, one that was a mix of seriousness and fear. Do not anger or upset her for any reason. She is not like other girls. At the time, I didn't understand what she meant. The advice seemed like the usual concern of a mother who wanted her daughter to have a happy marriage, and I didn't think much of it. Our married life began normally. 3 years passed without any significant issues, a calm and comfortable life, or so it seemed. Then came that fateful night. What started as a simple discussion between Hind and me quickly escalated into a heated argument. I lost my temper, and in a moment of anger, I stormed out of the house without apologizing. Little did I know that this moment would mark the beginning of a series of strange events that would change my life forever. The next day, I started noticing Hind's strange behavior. When I returned home in the evening, I found her sitting in the corner of the kitchen, staring blankly at the ceiling. For the first time, I noticed that her long black hair reached down past her knees, shining in the dim light in a way that seemed unnatural. I tried to talk to her, but she didn't respond. She just continued staring with that vacant look, as if she was seeing something I couldn't. As days passed, her behavior grew even more bizarre. Sometimes I would catch her staring at me with a disturbing intensity, as if she knew something horrifying about me. Other times I would leave her in the living room and go to the bathroom, only to turn around and find her standing silently behind me, watching with that unnerving gaze. Things reached a terrifying climax one night, When I woke up at 2 a.m. feeling thirsty, as I entered the kitchen to get a drink of water, I was met with a sight that nearly stopped my heart. Hind was clinging to the wall like a spider, staring at me with hollow, terrifying eyes. It felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, but the pain in my chest assured me that I was wide awake. At that moment, I couldn't take it any longer. I got up trembling and passed by her as she continued to stare at me with that horrifying look. I grabbed the phone with my shaking hand and immediately called her mother. When I told her what was happening, she cut me off, saying, "Didn't I tell you never to anger or upset her?" I replied in confusion, "How did you know about our problem?" Her mother answered in a quiet, eerie voice, "Your wife has been with me for the past 2 days. Why didn't you come to make amends?" I froze, unable to believe what I was hearing. If Hind was with her mother, then who or what was in my house? I looked back at Hind, who was now standing in the middle of the room, and remembered the warning. Her face began to change slowly, taking on a demonic expression. I realized then that I was facing something beyond explanation. Slowly, Hind began to approach me, her wide eyes glowing with madness, and her long hair swaying as if it had a life of its own. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. I felt like I was nailed to the spot. As she drew closer, the air around me grew heavier, as if she was draining the life out of the room. When she reached me, she stopped suddenly. She touched my face with her cold hand and said in a voice that was not hers, "I warned you." At that moment, a chilling cold swept through my body, and I collapsed on the floor unconscious. When I woke up, I found myself in a hospital room, surrounded by doctors and nurses trying to revive me. They told me I had been in a coma for several days, and they found me alone in my home. Later, I learned that Hind's mother had visited me and assured them that I was under severe psychological stress. But I couldn't shake the feeling that what had happened was not just a hallucination. I left Hind after that and never returned to the house where those horrific events took place. People say I've lost my mind, but I know the truth. There are things in this world that cannot be explained. Ancient spirits that inhabit places and exact revenge on those who ignore their warnings. I've learned my lesson well, and I will never forget it.
I've been working the night shift at a 24-hour diner for years. It's a quiet place, mostly truckers and late-night regulars. You'd think it's the kind of job that'd lull you to sleep, but I've seen things that'll keep you wide awake, staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m. It was a Tuesday night, one of those shifts where time drags. The clock barely moved and the diner was empty, save for one guy sitting in the corner booth. He was a regular, came in most nights, ordered coffee, and just sat there reading a newspaper. Harmless, or so I thought. I was at the counter wiping down the coffee machine when I heard the front door creak open. In walked a man, tall, gaunt, with a face so pale it seemed to glow under the diner's dim lights. He didn't say anything at first, just stood at the door, staring. His eyes were wide, too wide, like he'd seen something he couldn't unsee. I remember shivering, though it wasn't cold. He finally walked over to the counter, his footsteps unnervingly slow, dragging as if he were forcing himself to move. I greeted him with a forced smile, asked if he wanted coffee or anything to eat. He didn't respond. He just stood there, his eyes locked on mine. "I'm hungry," he finally whispered, his voice raspy, almost like a growl. "Sure," I said, flipping open my notepad. "What can I get you?" "I'm starving." The way he said it made my skin crawl. I suggested a few menu items, but he just shook his head slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. Then, without warning, he reached across the counter and grabbed my wrist. His grip was ice cold, like death itself. "I'm starving," he repeated, but this time his voice was different, low, guttural, almost inhuman. I yanked my hand back and stumbled away, heart racing. The regular in the corner looked up from his paper, sensing something was wrong. The strange man turned toward him, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in the regular's eyes. The man didn't move, just stared, before letting out this low, disturbing laugh. It wasn't a normal laugh. It echoed through the diner, vibrating in my bones. Then as suddenly as he'd come, he turned and left, disappearing into the night. The door didn't even make a sound when it closed behind him. The regular hurried to the counter, his face pale. "You need to call the police," he said. That man. I've seen him before. I didn't even ask what he meant. I just grabbed the phone and dialed. When the police arrived, they searched the area but found nothing. No trace of him. A few nights later, I was watching the news when a report came on. A string of disappearances in the area, all connected to people last seen at diners. And there on the screen was the man, the same gaunt, hollow-eyed figure. But here's the thing. The report said he'd died 3 months ago.